Hello, and welcome to the BIU's podcast interview with Allison Forsyth, partner and COO of ITP Sport, Canada's first full-service and programming safe sport agency. I'm Callum Murray, and in this interview, Allison discusses her own experience of abuse, defines safeguarding or safe sport, and explains how to recognise victims and how sports organisations can combat abuse. Stay tuned. So, Alison, welcome to this BIU interview. Very good to see you. I thought I would just begin by asking you, you're working in safe sport in part because of your own experience of abuse. Can you tell us what happened to you and how widespread do you think this problem is?
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. So, I am a victim of a survivor of egregious sexual abuse within the Canadian sports system dating back to the late 90s. So in my case, it was what we would consider in safeguarding here in Canada now, what we call a predatorial case. So it was a coach who was intending to do harm coming into a team. There was multiple victims, and unfortunately, there was what we consider now in safeguarding sometimes, a cover up of the organization really didn't do anything to prevent it from happening. And or once I blew the whistle and I said it was happening, they also sort of allowed him to resign, and there was no real, ramifications of his behavior. So this is why, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, safeguarding and independence around reporting is so critical. But in our case, he was actually not caught for 15 years. And what happened was one of his victims finally went to the police because she saw him coaching again. So very nervous, as most victims would tell you, including myself, that, something would happen to someone else that happened to her. So he was subsequently arrested, and we actually ended up in a very long, arduous criminal trial here in Canada, and he received a 12-year prison sentence. So quite a serious and high-profile case for Canada. Ironically, it was happening at the same time that many would know the Dr. Larry Nassar case, which was quite a infamous case out of USA Gymnastics. Our trial was happening at the same time. So that's how I got into this space. I started to advocate after that for change in Canada. I've learned a lot in that because safeguarding is much more than just, as I mentioned earlier, predatorial abuse. A lot of the maltreatment that we're seeing here in Canada is more around the cultural normalization of sport. So I'm happy to dig deeper into that, but that is, in essence, the behaviors, practices, conditioning of coaches that have been largely accepted over generations. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we're tackling it here in Canada for sure.
Just before we take it wider, predatorial abuse, in your case, can you be a bit more specific about what that involved?
Absolutely. So there's a process called grooming, and I highly recommend every single person that has an opportunity to listen to this to go do their own research on it, whether they're a coach, athlete, parent. It's very simple, and that's what's so terrifying is a predator, meaning someone that's intending to do harm. And it's not only to minors. So we have to recognize that grooming can happen with athletes that are of the majority age as well. But essentially it starts with favoritism. So the predator will sort of create have a target within a team environment that they want to abuse. They start to play that person as their favorite. Usually it involves then personal bond is the next stage, where they break down those walls of professional boundary. At that stage, which is exactly what happened to us. That's why I'm being, it seems theoretical what I'm saying, but this is exactly what happened to me and multiple victims. Gift giving, secrets telling, promises of a future outside of sport. And then there's physical and or mental isolation. That's the next stage. And that's where I think it's probably obvious to most people listening, the abuse occurs. That's where the victim is sort of separated mentally and or physically from the rest of the team. And then the last stage is called complicity, which a lot of people don't talk about. And in sport, I think that's very important because in sport with athletes, we have goals and dreams and are actually quite vulnerable and actually very easily based on that microenvironment can sort of feed into and almost blame ourselves for the abuse that we suffer. So it's a 4-step process. It's very eerie how the recipe seems to be followed based on, honestly, hundreds of victims in sport that I've had the privilege of speaking to about this. multiple research studies, of course. But our goal here in Canada now is prevention, obviously, and that involves understanding and being able to notice the first signs of the grooming process.
Yeah, you mentioned prevention. How would you define safeguarding or safe sport?
Yeah, so safe sport in our definition, we have a company, Canada's leading safeguarding agency. We're called Independent Third Party Sport. But safeguarding for us is creating a positive, healthy, safe training and competitive environment that is free of maltreatment and abuse. So that really is, and I think internationally we use the term we use the term safe sport here. Internationally, safeguarding is, I think, the international term, which essentially, when it comes to prevention, one thing I think I want to be very clear about is I think there's not anyone listening that doesn't know that there's policies around, codes of conduct around maltreatment or ethics. The reality that we've recognized is people rarely read or are educated on what those policies mean. Organizations will put them in place to hopefully prevent abuse, but really they just are there to serve protection of the organization once abuse has occurred. So part of our big mandate is to bring the policies off the paper. We have a universal code of conduct for maltreatment in sport here in Canada that every national organization must follow. And then I go in and do preventative education. So I work with athletes, coaches, parents, administrators on what safeguarding is, what the signs are. And honestly, like I've mentioned, a lot of times I work with coaches on how to shift some ingrained behaviors that are no longer accepted in sport. And I don't make them wrong for that. There's a lot of coaches out there that are intending to do well that are actually doing harm.
And just going back to your case again, sorry, I should have asked you what sport you practiced, and how widespread do you think the problem is in your sport and in other sports?
Yeah, so my sport is alpine skiing, so a little different than biathlon, but I did have the great pleasure of training with a lot of biathletes in Canmore, Alberta, where I lived. But essentially, downhill skiing was my sport. And what I want to say about safe sport, as far as your next question, is it's really sport agnostic. That's what we've recognized. So that's why we can create a universal code of conduct that should not be manipulated for any particular sport to allow certain behaviors, because maltreatment is maltreatment. So the widespread problem, again, I think we need to look at the predatorial problem, but then also in Canada here, we have 7 forms of maltreatment, including bullying, hazing, harassment, physical abuse, sexual abuse, discrimination. So with these other forms of maltreatment, that's where we get into that normalization of behaviors that are no longer accepted based on what we understand now to be trauma for the victim.
And I think you touched on this earlier, but the culture of sport, with a way of life that includes a lot of travel, that especially facilitates harassment and abuse, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we have uncovered here through Met's research is that the number one targeted victim and most vulnerable victim is a female athlete between the ages of 14 and 18 who has extensive travel, extensive time away from family, and extensive time opportunities to be alone with a person of authority. So the better you are at sport, the more vulnerable you are to abuse, which I think for many would be, sort of an odd thing to say, but it's really true. Once, as you mentioned, the travel comes in, and to be frank, I think any athlete listening and any coach even will understand that it's almost like sport becomes your own little world. And it's hard to see out of that. And it's hard to see what normal is when you were born and raised and now travel within this micro bubble of people and sport.
First of all, was there a reporting system? Was there a whistleblowing system in place in your sport at the time that you were being abused? And if so, were you able to use it?
No, there was not. And that's still, unfortunately, very common. Or if there's a whistleblowing mechanism in place, it's internal. So if you're looking at the news with Canada right now, much of the world's eyes are on this around safe sport because of the work I've done, to be honest. And it looks really bad. But I want to stress that Canada is actually one of the world's leaders, because I truly believe there's many countries that haven't even started this work. So in Canada, what is happening now, because there are independent places for athletes to come forward, or coaches even to come forward and report maltreatment, many more people are coming forward. So the gravity of the issue is being really highlighted through the media. In my case, whether something existed or not, it didn't. But I also did not, I felt like the only person I could tell was the person that had hired him. So there's extreme bias within an organization, whether that person intends to cover something up or, at the end of the day, you can understand if you're the head of a sports organization and someone comes to you and says, listen, someone you hired did something bad, and once this gets found out, your whole sport is done. It's very difficult for that person to not be biased in their decision-making.
So what kind of reporting system should sports organizations put in place to encourage victims of abuse to come forward?
One whole side of our company works in independent complaint management. So we work with over 100 organizations here in Canada. So the best system possible is that if you are within the organization, you actually don't have anything to do with the case. So what happens is a complaint will come in directly to our 24-hour hotline. It's posted all over that sport's websites. Ultimately, it's communicated very proactively to all participants that this whistleblower line is available. Then my team of safe sport experts and case managers will handle the case and work with both the complainant and the respondent through a very rigid due process to ensure fairness, equitable treatment. And then the outcome, there's sometimes an investigation, obviously, which is again done by an independent investigator. Then the outcome and the sanctions are brought back to the organization to put in place. So it is completely separate. And what those of you listening that are within an organization need to understand is you don't want to have that control. It's very quick now, especially here in Canada with the gravity of the issue, for an organization to be blamed if a complainant's not happy with the outcome. So it's time to sort of relinquish control of these things and hand over such a serious trauma-informed process to experts.
And without naming names, and to try and make this a little bit less theoretical, can you give me an example of a case that you've handled which you think was handled in the right way and the outcome?
Yeah, absolutely. So we handled a case very early on, which was a coach in the sport of rowing. And I can speak on this because it was a public case and he was named. So there was a complaint that came in against this person, and that complaint was ran through the proper independent third-party process. And that person ultimately was dismissed from their role and left the country. Now, the challenge, because we know we're speaking internationally here, which is fascinating, is Canada now is getting set up quite strategically and powerfully to, relinquish all coaching rights from certain coaches, having public registries of offenders. However, we have to ask ourselves, how does that translate across borders? Because what this individual did, which I believe many do, is they go to other countries to coach, especially at that high level of sport where we know they can move around quite easily. So what we have to do is extreme due diligence when we're hiring. So a lot of this comes down to recruitment of coaches and people of authority and doing extreme due diligence around safe sport and culture fit, not just what I say is hiring the guy who's the best because they have the most medals. That's what I fundamentally believe is something we have done in sport for decades and not generations. We look at a best coach as someone who gets results. So that needs to shift. And we need to look at coaches far more strategically around socio-emotional wellness, their treatment of their athletes, because we think that we have this belief that when athletes are treated poorly, it toughens them up and that's why we win. But that's a false belief. Do you see that? Like, that's an incorrect belief that I believe we've developed in sport that we're now proving here based on athletes we've helped have predators or perpetrators of abuse removed from their environment. We're very clearly seeing those athletes not only perform, but perform way better than when they had that coach. So that's, I think the fundamental problem is we believe that in sport, there's a certain way to be coached or there's a certain way to be treated that means that you're going to be a champion.
It's interesting you mentioned the problem of sort of international borders. Should there be some kind of international vetting system?
I believe absolutely. I think at the end of the day, there's, I'll give you another example. So I do work with Canada Soccer, and Canada Soccer had a coach. It was a public case that went to a criminal. It was sexual in nature. He pled guilty and received a year in prison. I helped that organization be able to remove his right to coach soccer anywhere in the world. So we had to work with FIFA and CONCACAF, and that was watching how incredibly difficult that was. It's stringent that some sort of, whether it's, Biathlon International or FIFA or FINA, like some governing body that has the ultimate governance over all sports organizations in the different countries. The IOC, they have actually, I believe, to be quite an excellent safeguarding unit starting now. But any of these major international governing bodies should have the rights. And I respect it's very challenging, privacy laws, all of these things. But I truly believe there needs to be an international vetting system and a removal of the right to coach in any country.
Last question. I think we've all, because of the Larry Nassar case and others, we've all become much more aware of safeguarding issues in sport. Do you think that as a result of that, sport is beginning to come to grips with this problem? What more can be done? And what's the role of a sports organization in combating abuse?
Yeah, so again, I want to highlight, as far as your first question, I mean, I think we are, there's awareness now. There's awareness, but we're in Canada, we're past awareness and we're in action. And with action comes, it looks really bad before it gets better. So as far as whether you're in a sports organization or you're responsible for a whole sport, you have to recognize that the process of getting through the reactive side of abuse, which is seeing a lot of people come forward and say they were treated poorly, is a critical step to get over the hump into truly making a difference. So again, while Canada may look like we're in crisis, it's because we're actually moving through a very important journey. And I don't believe that many, as I mentioned, many countries have sort of really understood what the gravity of this is, and they almost don't want to. I was talking to a coach from Australia that came to Canada to coach, and he said, back in Australia, a high-level coach, Olympic level, he said, back in Australia, we started to look at this, and we went, oh, never mind. Ooh, that's scary back there, right? So we have to open the door, and we have to be confident and proactive, because it is everywhere. There's not one organization we've ever ran into that doesn't have some form of maltreatment happening. As an organization, just to answer your last question, there are some critical steps. So obviously you need your policies and your codes of conduct, but then you also, as I mentioned, need to educate on those so that you're actually in prevention around them, not just using them when something bad happens. Training and education is absolutely critical. I do our training through webinars, in person, in a very conversational type way. I don't believe that we get enough off of online training modules. If someone could create an online training module that could actually tackle the gravity of this problem, I'm all for it, but I've never seen it. So it needs to be very concentrated education and awareness. Last but not least, we have to, as an organizational administrator, release, as I said, that control over managing our own complaints, because there is such fear of reprisal, ostracization. Athletes or any victim of maltreatment, a participant doesn't want to come forward unless they feel very safe to do so. So we need to create that safe environment to handle the complaint as we're working on the prevention. So those are three things: policies, codes of conduct, training, education, and independent complaint management.
That last one, the whistleblowing thing, I mean, I think a lot of athletes are still very unwilling to become whistleblowers for probably all the reasons that you're talking about. But what can sports organizations do to encourage athletes to become whistleblowers?
Well, first they need to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. So a lot of sports organizations that I've been in contact with will say, well, we have this all set up, Allison. But if you actually talk to their athletes, they're like, we just don't, there's not a culture of trust, there's a culture of silence. So you need to dig into your culture. And you need to have it being very open, transparent, and safe sport. I don't want to make it oversimplified. It needs to be a critical pillar in your operational strategy. How are you keeping your participants safe from maltreatment and harm? And I will have people say to me, well, Allison, we don't have any money. And I'm like, well, then you shouldn't be operating sport. If you can't fundamentally make a parent or an athlete feel safe to participate in your organization, you actually shouldn't have one. That's just the truth. It needs to be a very strong pillar. Board meetings, it needs to be on the agenda, et cetera. So you just have to bring it to light. And it's going to take time. Again, it's going to take time, because I'll tell you one thing that is also very fascinating is because of the deep conditioning of athletes, where maybe they've been yelled at their whole life or body shamed on the side of a pool deck, or they don't even necessarily identify as a victim. You have to almost show them the trauma that they've been under. See that? It's fascinating. Like if you had asked me, and I'm always as you can tell, a very honest, open person, because that's what I believe makes change happen. I would have told you back then that I had a boyfriend who was a coach, not someone who was sexually abusing me. I thought that we were in a relationship when I was being abused for part of it. And then I woke up. So it's almost like being in a cult, if that makes sense. It's like I woke up to what was actually happening and then found out this happening with multiple other young girls. So it's very complex the way it works in here. But I think the first critical steps is just to bring it into your organization, have the conversations and be ready, because it's a huge movement in sport. I don't think we've seen anything like it since anti-doping, to be frank.
Allison, very interesting. Thank you very much indeed for talking to me.
You're very welcome. Thank you.